for being here with us today. This is going to be a thought-provoking and also could be triggering topics that we're going to be talking about. So please do what you need to do to feel comfortable. Last night I was reading some more of Cal's blogs, and I just love the style of his writing. And one quote that really resonated with me was, he said, "It matters that the demands of the 1960s are the same demands as the 2020s. And, you know, we talk a lot about we still have so much more work to do, but when Cal put it in that context of, look what the protests, the demonstrations, the actions that were happening in the 1960s around civil rights, social justice, human rights, and you look at the protests, the demonstrations, the actions that we are taking now, and folks, we are still working on getting social justice for everyone, for human rights for each individual in our country. And so we know we still have a lot of work to do, and hopefully we are going to be working on system change, because that's the level that needs to be dismantled and rebuilt into it with a new context. And especially I think about the education system. But I am excited because Cal Montgomery is our guest today. If you don't know Cal, I'm sure you will want to be a follower of his work, his blogs when he's speaking. And I just appreciate the ability that he has to look at different perspectives and honor perspectives, but also be that voice as that disability activist. So today, Cal's going to be talking about redemptive abuse of power. And he'll talk a little bit about the two myths of power: power in children, power in disabled people, and therapeutic violence. We will have some time for Q&A at the end, so post your comments and questions there. We are recording, and the replay will be available on my Facebook page, Visions and Voices Together. If we haven't met before, I'm Charmaine Tanner. I'm a parent, a retired teacher, and an advocate for students so they can get the inclusive education that they deserve. So our guest, Cal Montgomery, is joining us today by telephone. And so we do have the live transcriptions running at the bottom of the Zoom page if you want to click down there so you can access the live captioning. Welcome, Cal. And what else would you like to tell our audience about you in case they don't know you very well?
Well, first, I'm going to tell you that somebody who was using my power chair and walking my dog has run over my phone. So it's likely that at some point I'm going to break up a little, and just please let me know and I can repeat stuff. And we're going to be talking a lot about seclusion and restraint today. So I wanted to give you a little bit of my background and where I come from. I was born before the Education for All Handicapped Children Act was passed. I was in grade school when it came into effect. But my father worked for the U.S. government. We moved around a lot, and my parents did not ever have me in the special education system. I got through college at about 19. And the next year, when I was 20, I was institutionalized for what was intended to be the rest of my life. So I had hoped to go to graduate school, but my post-baccalaureate education was all in long-term congregate care facilities. I was in 4 institutions over this period. After 4.5 years, the facility I was in burned down. And I have an alibi for that fire. It wasn't me. But the first few of us to find beds somewhere else got out. And that's really the only reason I'm free today. I subsequently worked in group homes, which are another form of institution, for a while because that was the only job I could get. Eventually, I got out of that field. And much more recently, as a middle-aged adult, I have spent time short-term in other institutions. So I have experience from several different perspectives on institutionalization, and I have also got experience in several different roles within the institutional system. I have all my life been somebody who technically engages in self-injurious behavior. And when I was young, I was also somebody who would assault other people. I have not put my hands on other people in anger since I was a child. But I did used to do that before I understood why one should not. I have not, for the most part, engaged in anything particularly dangerous, except in my second institution, where I was known as a pretty much uncontrollable headbanger. And so I have a lot of experience with seclusion and restraint and self-injury from that period. There was real concern at that point that I would probably fracture my skull, possibly kill myself. And that was not actually an unreasonable fear. Third institution was also a horrible place, but it was not nearly as horrible. And I did not need to do that there. And once I've gotten out, my self-injury has gone way down to the point that almost nobody can even tell. I'm very good at getting into private spaces like restrooms if something's going to happen. And even if it does, it's technically classed as self-injury, but it's not something that could really hurt me. Also, when I was working in the group home system, I supported a number of people who were also subject to restraint and or seclusion, and who were either routinely injured by themselves or routinely injured other people. And so, again, this is something that I have some experience of, something I've thought about. It became very clear to me very quickly that a lot of this is extremely context dependent. You'd see people who were severe self-injurers at a certain point in their life, and then they would transition to a different environment, and everything would change. So it wasn't just getting older. It was really very context dependent, and that was my experience as well, that in some places I simply needed to do it, and in some places I did not. And this is, of course, not at all how we were expected to think about it. When I was in the field, I was also trained in restraint techniques. So I have some experience of that. I refused to use them. I was only in a few situations where they would be expected of me. And in those cases, I chose to go with nonviolent de-escalation instead, which worked out for me pretty well. I have been injured, but that was in cases where there was no ability to separate and back off and give somebody space because of the environment that we were in. So I think it's important to acknowledge when we talk about this that, yes, some people do get into situations where there is a real danger of actual harm to actual people. And some people do actually cause significant damage to themselves or to other people. This is not in that sense, this is not an easy conversation to have. I know that very often some people in the discussion will think that other people in the discussion do not understand that fact. And I want to be very clear that I do understand it. I've known people who have detached their retinas permanently. I've known people who have blown out their eardrums. I've known people who have given themselves broken bones and caused other significant scars to their bodies. And I've known people who have been fairly badly hurt in situations where they were attempting to be supportive with varying results. I have had somebody come at me with a knife attempting to kill me. And actually, in that case, I did use something that I learned in restraint training, which is that nobody can stab you with a knife if they can't get within arm's reach of you. So we spent a long time circling the kitchen table that day before we managed to calm things down peacefully. So that's really important. And as we read the news even today, we're seeing a lot of news about Bob Saget, a comedian who died of a head injury not long ago, a very significant head injury. And so I think we need to recognize that many people who are dealing with this in practice feel extremely desperate about the situation and as if things are completely out of control. And that is understandable, but it is not, I think, the most significant factor. One thing that I think is really important to acknowledge is that much of the time, whether or not we move to restraint and seclusion, is not actually about safety. And you think it is. Most people think that it is. People will say, if I see you hit yourself on the head, I'm just going to restrain you. But at this point in my life, I don't hit myself very hard, and I don't go near my eyes and ears. There's really no chance of significant harm. If I lit up a cigarette, I would do more damage to myself. But I've never seen anybody get restrained or secluded for lighting up a cigarette, even if they're standing right next to somebody with asthma, in which case they can do fairly immediate and significant harm to somebody. I've never seen anybody get restrained or secluded as a result of trying to drive drunk. We're seeing an increasing number of restraints on airplanes these days. And it's interesting because, again, we talk a lot about how dangerous the situation is, but in many cases, the things we talk about are not the actually dangerous things. Somebody got hit on the head with a coffee pot quite recently on a flight. And people say, well, he was trying to open the emergency exit. If he had opened the emergency exit, everybody could have died. And that's true, but there was no way he was ever going to get the emergency exit open because the aircraft cabin is pressurized and human beings just aren't strong enough to open the door mid-flight. So, and the flight attendants would have known that. And it was a flight attendant who hit him with a coffee pot. So we're not really actually talking about what's dangerous. We're not evaluating what's really dangerous. We talk a lot about, people are threatening each other's lives here, but it usually isn't the really dangerous stuff that freaks us out. And certain extremely dangerous things that people do never get that reaction. Certain kinds of people do not get that reaction. So I think we need to acknowledge up front that while it feels like we're talking about safety, safety is not really the most key component here as to whether or not we're going to move to restraint and seclusion. I would argue that restraint and seclusion are the consequences, choices we make much earlier in the process. It's not a matter of what do we do in these few seconds that we have to make a decision. It's what have we done in the last several years. And again, we can go back to the airlines. Many of the violent incidents on airplanes involve alcohol. Not all of them, but many of them do. So one thing we could do to reduce the incidence of restraints on airlines is to stop serving so much alcohol on the flight and in the airport. That's a choice we could make, and we don't make that choice. But if we did that, we would probably reduce the number of in-flight restraints. Another choice that we could make is to take a row of seats out of service and put more flight attendants on the plane. The airlines aren't doing that. But one of the reasons that flight attendants feel that they need to go to restraint is that they're vastly outnumbered by the passengers on the plane. If there were more flight attendants, they would probably have more options in those few seconds when they're making the decision, but we don't make that choice. We could stress travelers less. We could give them larger seats. We could stop overbooking flights and making people anxious about getting kicked off. We could run fewer flights, making them more expensive, but also improving things like on-time arrivals and departures. These are choices we could make as a society if we wanted to. There would be consequences, and we wouldn't like all of the consequences, such as we wouldn't like because the price of air travel went up significantly. But we could make these choices and end up with fewer restraints. And when you watch some of these videos, I remember watching one a while ago. Somebody took a piece of tape off the passenger's mouth, and you could see that his mouth was still partly covered. This was after George Floyd. We all should have known by this point that you can suffocate to death in restraints while you are still able to voice, while you're still able to speak. It happens. Restraint-related asphyxia does not require that you be unable to speak for a significant period of time before you die. And we know that because we've all watched videos of this. But it was fascinating how when I said this out loud after this incident in which you could see that the passenger's mouth was partly covered with tape, and this was after they had taken tape off his mouth, people refused to believe that this was unsafe. One of the issues that airlines have with using duct tape to restrain people is that if somebody is duct taped to their seat, in an emergency, they cannot evacuate the airline safely, and they can block other people from evacuating safely. But we're still doing this. And most of the time, people look at these videos and think, yeah, it makes sense. Because what we're seeing is only those last few seconds. But many choices have been made that probably, we could probably not eliminate all cases of in-air violence without stopping in-air travel, but we could eliminate a lot of them. And we've chosen not to. Similarly, in schools, we do things such as we educate teachers, we educate the general education teachers to believe that really they're only qualified to teach 85% of students or 86% of students, not the students on the IEPs. We educate our special education teachers often far more in the way that their students are perceived as deficient than subject matter or social justice issues. We, as education has become more widely available to more people, we have sort of developed a model for mass producing it so that 30 children are expected to learn in lockstep. And that's simply not how children develop. You know, you cannot take 30 children who are within a year of each other in age and expect them all to learn the same thing at the same time in the same way. But that we act as if that is a perfectly reasonable explanation. We stress children, we stress teachers, we overload certain systems, we put people in places without adequate support to do whatever it is we're asking them to do, whether that is to be a member of a classroom or to learn algebra or to teach algebra or whatever. And then we act as if there's something wrong with people who cannot cope with a system that is simply not designed for all the people that are supposed to be in it. And this is, again, a choice that we as a society make. And this choice has moral roots. If we go back to our good old friend, Ivar Lovaas, who you may know as one of the originators of applied behavior analysis, he once said, developmentally disabled people have to work particularly hard. Their work is to learn, your job is to teach. The responsibility is shared. With responsibility, the developmentally disabled person takes on dignity and, quote, acquires, unquote, certain rights as a person. No one has the right to be taken care of, no matter how, and here he uses the R word, no matter how R word he is. So put your child to work. his work is to learn. I want you to think about that, because we could make another choice. We could decide that everyone has the right to be taken care of, at least to the standard of need, right? We don't have to agree that everybody deserves breakfast in bed, but we should be able to agree, if we wanted to, that everybody deserves to have adequate food, and everybody deserves to have a safe place to sleep, and everybody deserves to have shelter. We could make that decision as a society in the United States. Not all societies at all times have been able to make that kind of decision, but we certainly have that option. But here we have this man who is well respected, basically saying that nobody has the right to be taken care of. If we actually lived that way, nobody would survive infancy. We are a social species. We rely on each other to survive. We are taken care of in many ways. And the ways that typical people with a certain degree of money are taken care of, is fairly substantial, although it's also fairly invisible. For example, the fact that we have highways enables us to live in cities where we do not produce adequate food for the population and bring in food from elsewhere. That's a way in which I live in Chicago, so I'm clearly one of these people. I'm not producing actually any of the food that I eat. I'm not raising crops. I'm not slaughtering animals. I'm not butchering anything. And this is the way that society cares for me. Even though I don't drive, I rely on the highway system simply to eat. And I assume that most of you do as well, because the odds are if you were completely off the grid, you wouldn't be on Zoom at this moment. David Petoniak is retired now, but he has done a lot of work on people who behave in ways that other people find very upsetting. And he has suggested that there are 7 things that many people who behave in ways we do not like might be missing. They might be missing meaningful and enduring relationships, a sense of safety and well-being, joy in ordinary and everyday places, power and something or other that I can't read my own handwriting. It's probably something like control, but it's clearly not. It starts with a CH. A sense of value and self-worth, relevant skills and knowledge, and supporters who themselves are supported. And I think if we look back over just the period of the pandemic alone, we can see that many of us have lost many of these things. And as we've lost them, we have become more on edge, we've become more stressed, we've become less able to care for ourselves and care for our loved ones. Many of us have really struggled as we've lost these things. And I think we have to acknowledge that many of the people who are ending up being restrained and secluded in schools and in other settings, not just airlines. It happens in a wide range of institutional settings, such as group homes and intermediate care facilities, which a significant number of special education students will end up in these kinds of programs later, if they aren't already. They're missing some of these things. If you look, however, at most of the programs designed to reduce the behavior that seclusion and restraint gets blamed on, these are not the things we're trying to do. We're trying instead to teach people to tolerate things they don't like. One of the issues that I have, and it took me a long time to realize this, is fluorescent lights. My brain doesn't start getting wonky under fluorescence right away, and it doesn't get better right when the lights go off. So it took me a long time to catch on to what was happening. I was an adult before I realized that fluorescent lights really messed up my brain and made it very hard for me to understand what was happening around me and to control my behavior. As an adult now, I've spent over the last 2 years a lot of time in the hospital, and I know there are certain units that I'm really going to have trouble in because there are no windows and all there are is fluorescent lights. And on one of the units in my local hospital, the fluorescent lights never even get turned down at night. They're on 24 hours a day. And it usually takes me less than 2 days to become a complete mess in that unit. I can cope in units with windows. I keep the lights off in my room except if somebody needs one. Obviously, if phlebotomy comes in, we turn on the lights and we turn them right off when they go. But I can cope in those units, but I can't cope under the fluorescent lights. I've really never heard a behaviorist talk about turning off the lights as a way in the classrooms, turning off fluorescent lights as a way of reducing seclusion and restraint. But odds are pretty good that for some children, that would actually make a humongous difference. And I'm bringing up specifically behaviorism because our society is suffused with behaviorist ideas. We talk a lot about enabling people to do bad things. I believe that term came from alcohol abuse, but we do it all the time. I've recently heard teachers complaining, and to be fair, I do seek out the discussions where the teachers are least fond of teaching, specifically to see what they're complaining about. So I'm not getting a representative sample, but I've heard teachers complaining that students misbehave in their classroom, they get sent to the office. The principal finds out that they haven't had breakfast, they give them food, sends them back. And I say if they give them food, they're just rewarding their bad behavior. You could totally look at this as that it's very hard when you're 8 years old to cope with a whole lot of stressors when you're also hungry because you haven't had breakfast. But we don't do that. And I was thinking about this with my dog because I have a dog now. His name is Erastus. I love him. He drives me up the wall. And one of the issues that we've had as he has slowly grown up is that often when I tell him to do something, like, hey, sit, Erastus, instead of doing what I asked him to do, he will climb up and put his face in my lap and ask for a cuddle. And I think a lot about behaviorism all the time. And I am still so accustomed to this way of thinking about people that my initial reaction was to say, no, not until you sit. I'm not going to cuddle you till you sit. And then one day I said to myself, when I talk to people about this sort of thing, I say, if somebody is seeking attention from you, they probably need attention. If you meet their needs, they're probably going to be able to do better. And I said, why am I not even treating my dog this way? And so currently, unless I have a really good reason to believe that I know something that he doesn't know, such as if I know he's going to be sedated, I might withhold food so that he doesn't vomit and aspirate, because as a dog, he does not understand about sedation. But to the greatest extent that I can, I try to disbelieve him when he tells me he needs something. If I ask him to sit and he tells me he needs a cuddle, I cuddle him. And again, even people who are normally great critics of behaviorism will say, but you're just encouraging him to not do what he's being asked to do. And what I have found is that if I say, Erastus, I'm not going to cuddle you till you sit, the sitting basically never happens. It looks, if I concentrate on it, as if he can't sit. And I don't understand why he can't, but I'll trust him on that. On the other hand, if I ask him to sit and he puts his face in my lap and we cuddle, and then I say, hey, sit, it almost always happens. So the behaviorist techniques that I've clearly absorbed more than I thought I had when it comes to dogs, they don't seem to work. When I listen to what this dog tells me he needs, and again, it's not everything. He also thinks he needs to eat toilet bowl cleaner, and I'm not going along with that one. But if he says he needs a cuddle or he needs some water or whatever, I do my best to believe him and accommodate him. And what I have found is that as a result, he works a whole lot harder to do the things I'm asking him to do. He doesn't always get it right. He's deaf. So training has taken a little bit longer because he's got to be looking at me to see what I'm communicating. And also for the last 2 years, as I say, I've been going in and out of the hospital. So he's had a lot of disruption and a lot of anxiety. And this is partly why he has so many emotional needs. This is not ideal for him, but it's also not my fault. So I'm just accepting that and moving on. I'm doing my best for him, but he's also doing his best for me. And when I have told him that I really need something, he usually tries to cooperate with that too. He's not what most people would consider a well-behaved dog, but when I came home with a catheter in me, his immediate idea was, hey, tug of war. I only had to tell him once, please do not attempt to pull my catheter out of my body, and he never did it again. So clearly I managed to convey to him that this was a need for me, whereas maybe sit down while I'm pouring the water into your bowl is a want. And he really works with me on this. And honestly, I wasn't expecting that to happen, and I'm kind of ashamed of myself. Back in the 70s, Vic Finkelstein, who was a man from South Africa, living in Great Britain, and a number of other British disabled people, came up with something called the British social model. What is taught in the United States as the social model is not actually the same thing. Most of the rest of the world, when they're talking social model, they're focusing on a model of structural injustice in which individuals have impairments, and then disability, which is sort of disenablement, is social injustice imposed on top of whatever the impairments are. So what we tend to call disability in this country, they call impairment. What we call ableism is a lot closer to what they call disability. I remember the day that I first found a book explaining social model theory to me. I was in a Barnes & Noble, and I stood there and just flipped through this book, and I took it home. It changed my whole understanding of the world. We normally treat the world as neutral and try to modify the people in the world to fit the world. But what if you just took the people as given and tried to fit the world to the people? For instance, what if you didn't say, this child cannot succeed in mainstream education because it cannot learn in a room full of 30 people, and said, it doesn't have to be 30 people. You know, we could find ways to, say, break up rooms and have more teachers in the room so that teachers are working in smaller groups. What if we said this child cannot function in a room that's loud? What if we stopped saying that and instead installed acoustic baffling in the classrooms so that the rooms were not as loud, even with the same 30 children who make the same amount of noise? We could do that. That's actually an option. And we tend not to think of that. So we have children who fail out of inclusion, and that's big scare quotes, because without the supports that inclusion actually requires, and in the context of an environment that is built in a way that is very hostile to them, they do not succeed. But that's not about inclusion. That's about the fact that we're putting this child in a situation that they can't cope with and not giving them supports. And these situations are not fixed. There are things in the world we cannot change. We could change what our classrooms are like. We could change how many people are in our classrooms. These are choices that we could, as a society, make, and we don't. And then some kids, because of whatever's going on in their lives, it might be at home, it might be at school, it might be in the general world, whatever, they can't cope. And if we start with the assumption that they're not being manipulative and they're not trying to do things to us, they're just not coping. And if we were to really seriously invest in changing the way we do things so that they fit every student in the class and not just the 85% of students who are not on IEPs, and not just the middle class students with two parents at home growing up white in white neighborhoods, and not just the children of college educated people, but every student in the school system, or every student who had a right to be in the school system, we would get a very different result, I believe. So let's talk about that fascinating phrase that I used. There's a theologian called Walter Wink who wrote about what he called the myth of redemptive violence. And I remember when I first came across that phrase, it just fascinated me. But the idea basically, and here I'm quoting Walter Wink, is that violence saves, that war brings peace, that might makes right. It is one of the oldest continuously repeated stories in the world. And again, we see this everywhere, all right? If you watch an awful lot of TV and movies, you will see a bad guy does something, and then the good guys come in and in some violent way defeat the bad guys, and order is restored to the world. And I think to a significant extent, that's what's happening in our classrooms, honestly, is that the child who does not, I saw a fascinating job description actually this morning in which they were looking for somebody who had a sense of appropriate versus abnormal development. And I found it fascinating here that they could just say that atypical developmental curves are inappropriate. I mean, what would that even mean? These aren't choices that the children are making to develop in a different way than is typical. This is encoded into their bodies, including their brains, that some children just learn things in a different sequence, or do not learn certain things, or learn certain things at a different time or in a different order. And we're actually sitting here talking about appropriate versus abnormal development as if it's actually a matter of what's appropriate here, as opposed to this is just how children are. A whole lot of them follow roughly similar developmental curves, and then some are on different curves. That's a very neutral way of saying it instead of a judgmental one. But as we pressure parents to prepare children to, at 18, go to college, and at 23 to hold down competitive jobs in a capitalist system, preferably white-collar jobs, because we don't like blue-collar jobs anymore. Parents are under a great deal of pressure to get their children to do this. Teachers are under a great deal of pressure to march 30 children through a sequence of learning experiences that, honestly, most of those children do not see why they need. And it's completely understandable why your average child does not see why algebra is important. I think it is, but it's not immediately apparent when you don't know algebra yet. What we have is a situation where perfectly normal human variation is perceived as a loss of control, and people feel that it is their responsibility to get control of this human variation. And in the most extreme cases, they will resort to violence because violence is what we think works. And we keep coming back to this. Even the behaviorists say that rewards work better than punishment. But when they're really desperate, they turn to punishment. If rewards work better than punishments, why would you turn to punishments in the most difficult cases? It would seem you go to rewards all the harder. Or we know, for instance, that torturing people does not actually produce useful information. People who are being tortured will tell you pretty much what they think you want to hear. And if they think you want to hear that there's a bomb in New York City, they'll tell you that because they'll do anything to make it stop. But and again, we can look at this and listen to this. We will turn to torture and violence against all kinds of people because we think it's an effective way to do good in the world. And I think that's really where we are in a lot of the schools, is that the teachers are faced with a child who appears to be out of control in some way or other that the teacher finds very anxiety producing and may or may not have potential to cause harm, but again, often doesn't have any more potential to cause harm than other things that are tolerated every day. And without looking at all the choices that have been made over the many years to get here to this point, I mean, back at least as far as the 70s, right? They turn to seclusion and restraint, which are forms of violence and escalation of violence, and they try to create safety through doing one of the most unsafe things they can do. Seclusion and restraint results in injuries and death. Table flipping can also result in injuries and death. But the idea that doing unsafe things to create safety is actually sound educational policy is really built into our system. So I know I've already kind of expended the amount of time I'm supposed to spend, so I'm just going to quickly go through the myths of power. There are two really big ones. One is that we don't have much power. People feel when they do things, including escalating to violence, very often they feel as if they don't have any choice but to escalate to violence. And again, I do this too. When the dog pees on the kitchen floor, I say, why are you doing this to me? Realistically, he's not doing anything to me. Maybe I didn't get him out in time. In many cases, it's just that he's anxious. He's thinking, oh no, it's going to be time to go in the crate soon. Or he's very excited. He's seeing my roommate and he wants to jump on her and he just loses control. It happens with him. But I think, why are you doing this to me now? You're making me do these things. And we often do that. And the other is that we deserve what power we have. And pretty much all of us think that. Parents have power over children, but most parents coping with special ed feel like they are the most powerless people in the system. In fact, their children have less power than they do. And I'm not saying parents in special ed have a lot of power, because we all know they don't. But kindergartners in special ed have a lot. Teachers feel as if they are at the mercy of all kinds of systems, and they are incredibly powerless. But again, they have tremendous power over the 30 lives in their classroom. Principals feel as if they don't have power. But again, they have a certain amount of power. And so we have people who deny that they have power and deny that they could possibly be using it wrong, and therefore do not think seriously about the uses of power and the way they're using it. And again, seclusion and restraint are fairly dramatic forms of power. I've been restrained. I've been secluded. There's a lot of adrenaline. It's basically a fight. And sure, it may not look like a fight when the person's 3, because you can overpower a 3-year-old fairly easily if you're a typical adult. But for the child, this is absolutely a fight. So we feel free to use violence in the service of what we think is the good. We feel free to use violence as a teaching tool. Again, not with everybody, but everybody faces the threat of that, although certain people are far more likely to experience it. We feel free to use violence in the therapeutic sense, and this is the issue we're fighting out with the Doug Rotenberg Center. But we're also fighting it out in many other places. We see it over and over again in service provision for adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, for adults with psych labels. It tends to be slightly less therapeutically understood, in my experience, in physical disability context. But for adults with dementia, certainly, people are restrained, quote, for their own good, unquote. And I think this is one of the issues that we need to struggle to change society on, and in particular, with respect to this audience, to change our school systems. Because I do not believe that we can create a sense of safety and actual safety and well-being through violence. I just don't believe it's possible. I don't believe a war to end all wars is possible. and we certainly have not achieved one yet. All right, so I will shut up now because I've been babbling for a while and see if anybody else has anything they want to say.
Hi, Cal. Thank you so much. Michelle had a quick question. If you had a specific social model theory book that you would recommend?
I would start. So the most famous one in this country is Michael Oliver's The Politics of Disablement. There's a second edition which I haven't read, but that's what I read. But if I were you, I would start at the Disability Archive UK, which is at Leeds University, and look for a paper called Fundamental Principles of Disability by the Union of the Physically Impaired Against Segregation. That's the original one. And from there, I would probably continue to look through the archives, specifically focusing on Vic Finkelstein's work. There's a lot more. There are critiques of this model. There are many other things, but that's where I would begin if I were you.
Okay, great. Thanks. And I'll be putting out a newsletter with the links that Cal's mentioned today. So if you don't get my weekly newsletter, let me know if you're interested. And so we have a great group in our audience today, Cal, and I thought what we could do is if you want to unmute and ask Cal your question, I think that's a nice way to do it versus depending on the chat. So Dinah, I know you've asked some more questions. Michelle, Julie Bailey's in here commenting too. So would somebody like to unmute and either make a comment or have a question for Cal?
Hi, this is Dinah. I didn't actually ask a lot of questions. I just found that some of the concepts to be really great, and especially what you just talked about. I'm wondering if I should start explaining to districts, explaining behaviorism to districts by saying you're using violence as a teaching tool, and maybe that would get them to listen.
Honestly, I don't know. I wish that I had access to polling firms and that we could test messages. I'm still struggling with how to explain this. I will say that whenever they regard what they're doing as, quote, positive behaviorism, unquote, which all schools do, they're not going to agree that it's violence.
Right, that's where I'm kind of thinking ways of explaining it as violence because it's so boundary dismantling for students.
I mean, honestly, even if you look at step one of behaviorism, which is, quote, pairing, unquote, which is to teach the child to depend on the adult. And again, I'm saying child and adult, but they will also do this to adults. And to regard them as a source of positive things. I mean, we've seen very similar behavior from people like Larry Nassar, Bill Cosby. It looks very much like grooming behavior, grooming of both the person that you're going to target and the people who could stop you. The recent documentary about Bill Cosby really focuses on the way that he groomed the people around him to not question some of the things that he was doing. Whereas if you focus on some of the discussion of Larry Nassar, you see the way that he groomed the children in particular to tolerate harm that he was going to cause to them. And it's really disturbingly similar to a lot of the early stages of behavioral approaches that look very positive to parents. And I think it's really important to note that Nassar repeatedly abused children with their parents in the room completely unaware. And this wasn't that they were neglectful or unobservant parents. It's that if you're really good at this, it doesn't look to most people like abuse.
Yes. Thank you. I think Michelle had a question, an actual question.
Is that me, or is there more than one Michelle?
I think that's you, Michelle.
Okay. When you talk about power, Cal, one thing that I came across, I read over the summer, I read Robert Greene's Power, the 48 Laws of Power.
Mhm.
And when reading that, I came across Law 37. And it says, just real quick, creating compelling spectacles is a form of power. So striking imagery and grand symbolic gestures create the aura of power, and everyone responds to them. Stage spectacles for those around you, then full of arresting visuals and radiant symbols that heighten your presence, dazzled by experience or by appearances that no one will notice what you are really doing. So when we are overcompensating so much, and just overriding the brain's limbic system to even function at that point. I'm studying philosophy, and I can't help to think that something so over the top as seclusion and restraint in schools or anytime is really creating a spectacle. And is that, have you ever come across that kind of reasoning when it comes to, practices that just completely degrade and humiliate, strip people of their dignity?
Okay, sorry. My phone keeps telling me I'm muted and unmuted. I don't think I've seen it put that way, but I certainly think it's true. I know that where I was, we were adults, and we, again, vastly outnumbered the staff. And so when they were going to, it would be a takedown, and then they would transport you to the what was called a quiet room, the seclusion room, and then they'd put you in restraints in there, and mechanical restraints. And I mean, it really was, you would see them massive. You would see them standing in the posture of getting ready, which, by the way, to people who have not been taken down, doesn't look threatening at all. You can hear their feet thundering as they pound down the hall. I mean, it's very dramatic, and when there's a takedown happening anywhere on your unit, whether or not you're involved in it. And of particular interest was the fact that because they had all this preparation to go through, usually any danger that was happening was over by the time they started their takedown. I remember one time it took 45 minutes after I did something that upset them for them to even start the takedown, because that was the night I did not think I was going to survive it. And so, yes, it absolutely is an incredible show of power for everybody who's watching. And again, since we congregate the children that most people don't want to deal with into rooms together, you've got a very specific audience for this kind of thing. Some people can go through their entire time at school and never see a restraint. And some people are probably seeing it at least once a month, or even far more than that.
Yes, thank you, Cal. And when you were talking earlier too about all the different options that we often don't take the time to think about, and so it reminded me of a conversation that Norm and Emma and I had on a live Facebook show a couple of weeks ago. And Norm, I don't know if you want to speak to this, but the whole idea of, Norm calls it like thinking like Houdini, and being a problem solver, being a believer in possibilities and that there is a way of doing things. And we have such, I think, knee-jerk reactions as people in situations, and we come back to those patterns of behavior that we have, established, and we don't take the time to reflect and really look at what else could we be doing in this situation. So Norma or Emma, I don't know if you'd like to unmute and speak to that.
Sure, I'll just say something quickly. Yeah, the thing you hear from teachers or principals or other people who engage in this type of behavior is, well, there's nothing else I can do, right? That's the, I guess, rationale that's often given. And that presumes you already know every single thing that could be done, right? And thinking like Houdini is the point. Is why I like Houdini so much as a model or as a role model, just an idea, is he consistently took things that people thought were impossible and figured out how to do it. So the thinking like Houdini is, what's fascinating about his tricks is when you actually learn how he did it, it was very, very simple. So I think we overcomplicate it. So I'll just say, thinking like Houdini is a real commitment to figure out how to do something that the wide society thinks can't be done. You want?
Yeah, I'll just add something quickly. One of the things that I learned when I was doing research for my book from hostage negotiators of all people was that the most important thing in a crisis situation is to change the way we see people. And one of the ways in which they described that to me was dead simple. They said, you gotta look at a person who's doing something maybe that you don't like or is in a crisis situation and think to yourself, just a person in a bad place. And then you move from there. And the other thing they said to me was go slow to go fast.
I think those are all really good points. I think another thing we need to think about is that Houdini does not get himself into these situations and then think, how shall I get myself out? He prepared. And hostage negotiators prepared. We tend to define these crisis situations as being seconds or minutes long. It isn't, we tend to think they start whenever we notice this person getting ready to escape. And that's really not true. A lot depends on how we are trained. I have twice in my life had people come at me with knives. The first time, I was a college student. I was walking home from the library, and, I really had no idea how to handle it. The second time, I was working in a group home, and I had actually thought at this point about, because I was working with people who sometimes did and do violent things, and I had thought about, what would I do? And I thought, well, if somebody gets a knife, I'll try and get on the other side of the kitchen table so they can't reach me. So that was my first move. And from the first situation did not go very well for me. I didn't get hurt, but it did not go well for me. The second situation, it took hours to resolve it because the person was really, really having an extremely bad day for reasons completely out of their control. But we resolved it completely peacefully. And this is really because I had, by this point, put significant amount of time into preparing for a situation like this. We prepare teachers for these situations in how they're trained. They're trained in restraint. They are trained in behaviorism. They are trained in looking at children with disabilities as collections of deficits. They are trained in these things. They are trained in thinking the least restrictive environment for a lot of children is, in fact, extremely restrictive. If you look at the United States system, some people who deal with folks having really bad days are police officers, and with a fair amount of regularity, somebody gets shot. You know who deals with a lot of people who are having really bad days and doesn't shoot them? Is night clerks at convenience stores. They also are doing an extremely dangerous job where they have a lot of potentially violent conflicts. But the difference is that we train police officers to pull guns, use guns, to see themselves surviving the situation as the most important thing. And that is not how we train clerks at 7-Eleven. Clerks at 7-Eleven are expected to handle the situation differently. And so they come at these situations with different preparedness. And so when they're in these heightened emotional states in very stressful circumstances for a few minutes at a time, they default to a completely different pattern of behavior than the police do. And this training starts years before people get in these situations in most cases.
Yes, and Corey is thanking you, Cal, for this fantastic discussion, and everyone else here. We appreciate your comments, and we do have a few more minutes. If there are other comments or questions, feel free to unmute and share your voice.
Yeah, this is Leah. I have a comment, thinking about the way we prepare teachers or educators, and then tying it to, Cal, with what you were saying about your dog and rewarding a behavior. And I really relate to that, but I also think teachers are really have this other layered on part that if they do this, they're going to lose, like, quote, control of the entire class. That if they respond to the actual needs of this kid, then what's everyone else going to see? And I think it's so deeply entrenched in that behaviorist attitude that they miss the opportunity to see that it's actually a really amazing act of inclusion. And what the other children will see is that we're responsive and relational and that we care for one another. I don't know if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, I think if you meet people's expressed needs and other people see that, they are probably going to express their own needs to a greater extent as well. And if you see people expressing their needs as a loss of control and a loss of credibility and a loss of professional authority, then that's going to be very threatening. It really is. I have done a little bit of teaching. I had hoped to be a teacher. Obviously, that did not work out successfully for me. But I always loved those moments in the classroom where things just went totally unpredictably. I was teaching a group of teenage boys. It was a small church, so my class happened to be entirely teenage boys in Sunday school once. And we had I was always paired with somebody else, but I was there for a semester and they kept swapping out. So I was with the absolute shyest man in the entire church, and we were talking about the Annunciation, where the angel of God shows up and informs Mary she's about to get pregnant. And one of the boys who had a reputation at that church said, "So, what you're telling me is God's a rapist." My co-teacher went absolutely white. I thought he might have had a stroke, but I thought it was the best comment that we had all year. We had a wonderful conversation about what people believe they can expect from God and what God should be able to expect from people, and how that has changed over 2,000 years of theology. And I loved it. But, you know, most teachers are taught that that is not the moment you want to have in a classroom. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that if we see what these kids are doing as manipulative or problematic or as assertions of their own power over teachers or as disruptions from the authentic work of school or whatever, then yeah, it is going to be absolutely threatening to show anybody else that it could possibly work. If we see them as expressing their needs, expressing that they have been pushed to the brink and over the brink, then we see something completely different. We have teachers, and again, as I say, I seek out the teachers that are most going to upset me, so I'm not seeing a representative sample. But we have teachers complaining that students right now are just absolutely not table ready. That's not the word they use because they're gen ed teachers. And I think, you know, here you've got 30 kids coming into this classroom and trusting you enough to show you that they've been deeply traumatized by the pandemic. You could see that as a positive thing. But yeah, they're probably not going to learn that much spelling in the middle of all this trauma. And we have teachers who want to quit because they cannot cope with all this. And trauma, other people's trauma is legitimately traumatizing. So I'm not saying that everybody should be able to cope with it. But I see it as a very hopeful thing that we're seeing all kinds of behavioral disruptions in schools right now. Because it means these kids are still reacting emotionally and showing people what they need and making themselves vulnerable in front of these adults. But that does not seem to be how everybody sees it. And admittedly, I'm not in the classroom, and I'm sure it would be a lot more stressful for me if I were in the classroom than if I'm sitting at home reading about it on the internet.
Yes, the times we live in, right? Judy, do you want to unmute and share your comment? I think it's more powerful than when I read people's comments.
Okay. I just wanted to reflect that learning happens through positive relationships and people having a sense of belonging and not with manipulating reinforcers. And we need to figure out how to help behaviorist thinking teachers unlearn or shed those perspectives about control and command and to gain those new perspectives of connecting and supporting and assisting. Lots of work to do. It's one thing to teach new teachers in training what to do, but the vast number of others who are still in the old thinking need to be assisted out of that thinking. And this has been a very powerful. I was just going to say, Carol, this is very powerful. Thanks for this great presentation.
Well, thank you. I think it's really fascinating that children are born and they start learning immediately. And they'll go 3, 4, 5 years just learning everything around them. And then we put them in school and we panic because as far as we can tell, they're not learning anything. People are always learning. And again, the most extreme brain damage may stop that. And I'm talking, when there's no EEG or whatever. But people are always learning. They may not be learning algebra. A lot of people are not learning algebra. But people are always learning. And we've come to see learning as something that, again, has to happen in a predictable sequence according to a certain curriculum and at specific times across the school year. And having really restricted our definition of learning, it can look like people aren't learning because some people do not learn how to factor a trinomial at the assigned time. In fact, I would suggest that most people don't learn it at the assigned time. But people are constantly learning. And And that means there's constant opportunities to teach. And again, you can't always be teaching the same stuff that you might want to be teaching. I might want to teach you about, I don't know, World War II, but you might not want to learn that. But people are constantly learning, even in school, where we think they're not.
Well, Cal, I want to thank you so much for giving your time today. This has been a very intriguing conversation that, you know, hopefully is helping each of us think of ways that we can be proactive and that we can assist our school district in making these kinds of systemic changes that we know are needed, right? So Cal, thank you so much. This has been a great presentation and discussion with you.
Well, thank you all for putting up with my babbling.
Not at
obviously, I like to perseverate on certain topics, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity.
Well, as I said, we're recording the Zoom, so I will post the link for the recording, the replay, also in the newsletter, and I will post the replay up on my Visions and Voices Together Facebook page. So there'll be ways that you can encourage, you know, friends, colleagues, coworkers to come and watch the replay, because this is the kind of message that we need to hear, and we need to act on the things that we know have to change. So I am Charmaine Tanner. Thank you all for being with us live or watching the replay. And I will be hosting another live show next Thursday at noon Mountain Time on my Facebook page. Until then, take care and keep on keeping on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cal.
Thank you both.
And it's possible that even somebody watched that doesn't personally know me. So,
Yes. Yes. All right.
So thank you very much, Charmaine, for hosting this. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you, Cal.
Take care.
Oh.
You too.